The air was heavy, thick with a suffocating dampness that clung to everything. The walls of Ash Pine Inn loomed dark and oppressive, as if they were part of something much older than the world outside. The hallways stretched endlessly in all directions, looping and twisting, defying the laws of space and time. Each door that appeared, no matter how many times it was passed, always seemed new, always beckoning with an allure that felt both familiar and deeply foreign. For as long as they could remember, the protagonist had wandered these hallways, each step an echo of the last. It was never clear how long they had been here or why they kept walking. Time seemed to slow, to bend, and to stretch, never quite functioning as it should. Every step they took seemed to bring them closer to something, but what it was remained hidden. The hallways, endless and twisting, seemed to change their shape with every passing moment, like some sentient force rearranging its walls to keep the protagonist trapped. The feeling was overwhelming. Ash Pine Inn wasn't just a building, it was a place of memory and loss, a reflection of the protagonist's very soul. The ceilings felt lower with each step, and the floors creaked beneath them as though the building itself were alive, breathing, watching. The protagonist had learned to stop trying to make sense of it. There were no answers here, only more doors. The doors, they were the key to this place. They always led somewhere, yet nowhere in particular. Each one was a window into a different memory, a different version of their life. Some doors led to distant memories, moments from childhood. Others opened to flashes of pain or joy, like fragments of a dream. Each time the protagonist opened a door, they glimpsed the reflection of themselves in the mirror-like surface within, a brief and fleeting glimpse of who they once were. The reflection was always different, though. Sometimes they were younger, sometimes older. Sometimes they looked exactly the same, but with a strange emptiness in their eyes. There was a sensation of déjà vu, a sense that they had walked this path before. The memories felt like fragments of a shattered glass puzzle, pieces that didn't quite fit together. Faces, names, events, everything seemed jumbled, as if time itself had collapsed and reformed in a twisted version of reality. It was disorienting, it was maddening, and yet every time they passed a door, they felt an irresistible urge to open it, to peer inside and see what new fragment of their life awaited. And each time they felt the tug of something deeper, something older at the edges of their consciousness. There were whispers that no one could hear, soft, quiet murmurs that brushed the back of their mind just out of reach. At first, it had been easy to ignore, but after so many days, or was it weeks, the whispers had become louder, more urgent. They weren't speaking words, but the meaning was clear. Look deeper. You must find it. The protagonist had tried to ignore the voices, to focus on the task at hand, but the more they tried to move forward, the more they found themselves drawn back to the doors, to the reflections within. Each time they opened one, they were sucked deeper into the maze of memories, unable to break free. And yet, they could not stop. It was as if something inside them was controlling their every move, leading them down this endless hallway with no way out. Every step was a trap, a cycle that repeated itself endlessly. The door at the far end of the hallway stood out. It wasn't like the others. It wasn't just another portal to the past or a window into another version of their life. This door seemed different. It was older, worn with marks along the frame, as though it had been used countless times before. The paint was chipped, the wood warped and groaning under the weight of age. There was no handle, just a gap between the door and its frame that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The protagonist hesitated for a moment before reaching out. The moment their fingers brushed against the door, the air around them grew heavier. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They could almost hear their name being called from beyond the door, a voice filled with both longing and warning. With a deep breath, they pushed the door open. The room inside was dark, but not entirely. There was a faint glow coming from the far side, casting eerie shadows that stretched across the floor. The walls were lined with mirrors, reflecting the room in 1,000 fragmented pieces. Each mirror held a different version of the protagonist, some with eyes full of hope, others empty and hollow. Some versions were smiling, some were crying, and a few were completely unrecognizable. The reflections were warped, as if the mirrors were trying to trap them in a distorted version of themselves. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding. The protagonists stepped inside, their footfalls muffled by the soft carpet that covered the floor. They tried to focus on the glow in the corner, but their attention was immediately drawn to the mirrors. They moved closer, each step taken with a mixture of curiosity and fear. As they approached the nearest mirror, the reflection that stared back at them was not their own. It was something else, something they couldn't explain. A shadowy figure stood behind them, its face obscured by darkness. It was tall, gaunt, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. The figure's lips didn't move, but the protagonist could hear its voice, cold and distant, whispering their name. They spun around, but the room was empty. The figure was gone. They turned back to the mirror, but the reflection had changed again. Now they were standing alone, the shadowy figure completely gone. But the room felt different, more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in on them, the reflections becoming more distorted with every passing second. The whispers were louder now, more urgent, and the protagonist could feel their heart racing in their chest. They couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until they understood what was happening here. But the more they tried to look deeper into the mirrors, the more they felt themselves losing control. The reflections grew more chaotic, their own image shattering into 1,000 fragments, each piece pulling them deeper into the abyss of memories. It was then that they realized the truth. This wasn't just a room, this wasn't just a reflection of their life. It was a prison, a place designed to keep them trapped, to keep them repeating the same cycle over and over again. They were never meant to escape, and as they reached out to touch the mirror, the reflections reached back. Fingers pressed against the glass from the other side. Faces stared back at them, eyes wide with a mix of fear and recognition. They knew what had happened. They knew what was coming. The protagonist took one final step forward, and the mirrors swallowed them whole. The protagonist had been walking through the never-ending hallways of Ashpine Inn for what felt like an eternity, yet time had become meaningless here. The walls were lined with hundreds of doors, each one waiting to be opened. It was as if they had always been here, as if the doors and the hallways had been constructed for them alone. The longer they stayed, the more it seemed that they could not escape. Every step seemed to echo the same haunting silence, broken only by the creaking of the doors when they were opened. The protagonist had learned early on to avoid becoming too attached to any of the doors. Each time they opened one, it pulled them deeper into a disorienting spiral of memories. They had once thought that these memories were valuable, like fragments of a life well lived, but they soon realized that each door only offered distorted views of the past. Sometimes what was revealed was comforting, a glimpse of something they had forgotten. But more often than not, the memories were warped and painful. One door opened to a long-forgotten childhood moment, a brief flicker of happiness spent with family in a sunlit yard, the warmth of the sun on their skin, the laughter of their siblings echoing through the air, the smell of freshly mowed grass. It all came flooding back. For a moment, the protagonist felt at peace, but that peace was quickly shattered as the memory began to twist. The sun faded and the once joyful laughter turned into harsh, echoing screams. The grass grew dark and withered. The joyful faces of family members contorted into expressions of anger and fear. In an instant, the warmth turned to cold. The peaceful moment warped into something nightmarish. The protagonist slammed the door shut, heart racing, only to find themselves facing yet another door. Another door led to a moment of loss. It was the image of a loved one's face, twisted in pain, fading away in the dark. The protagonist could still feel the sting of that moment in their chest. The final goodbye, the feeling of helplessness, the empty ache that followed. They had tried to bury this memory, to push it out of their mind, but now it stood before them, uninvited, raw, and unbearable. The face in the memory was unrecognizable now, twisted in anguish, the once familiar features becoming alien. The protagonist reached out as if to touch the face to try to make sense of the pain, but the moment dissolved into darkness, leaving them with only the cold, empty void. The memories began to blend together, becoming harder and harder to separate. The protagonist could no longer tell which memory belonged to whom, or even if the people they saw in these memories were real. The faces in the memories were becoming more and more distorted. They were all but shadows now, flickering images in a place that had no true meaning. Faces that had once been dear to them, family, friends, loved ones, were now merely hollow reflections. Was it the inn that had done this to them? Had they always been like this? Or was this something that the inn had made them see? The doors spoke to them in cryptic ways, their whispers carrying echoes of voices long forgotten. They heard the laughter of children, the soothing sound of a mother's voice, the reassuring words of a friend. Each door held a promise, a fleeting chance to reconnect with the past, but it was always a lie. These memories had become tainted by the inn, corrupted and twisted until they bore no resemblance to reality. The memories weren't just distorted, they were warped, mutilated into something far darker, far more sinister than anything the protagonist had ever known. As the protagonists wandered down the hall, they tried to keep their focus. They tried not to look at the doors too closely, to avoid being pulled into their grip. But the temptation was always there. Each time they passed a door, they could feel its pull, the way it beckoned them to look inside, to step through and relive the past. They had learned that there was no escape from this place, no way to outrun the memories. Every door was a trap, a reminder that they were stuck here, trapped in a cycle that they couldn't break. With every door they opened, the memories grew more vivid. They saw the face of a lover, their eyes soft with affection, but the affection quickly turned to something darker. The soft words of love became harsh, accusing. The eyes, once filled with warmth, turned cold, filled with distrust. The protagonists saw their own reflection in the eyes of the other, the same look of despair and confusion mirrored back at them. They slammed the door shut, but the images were seared into their mind. They could still feel the coldness of the gaze, the suffocating sense of isolation. Another door led to a moment of triumph, a fleeting victory that had once meant everything to them. They remembered the joy of success, the feeling of being on top of the world. But as they opened the door, they saw that success slipping through their fingers. The course turned to doubt, the triumph to regret. The protagonist had never truly been happy in that moment. They had only been seeking validation, approval from others, and in the end, it had never been enough. The victory was hollow, the applause meaningless. The door slammed shut, but the taste of failure lingered. The memories were becoming overwhelming. The protagonist could feel their grip on reality slipping, each door pulling them deeper into the abyss of their own mind. They no longer knew which parts of their life were real and which were just figments of the inn's manipulation. The doors had become a cruel reminder that their life had been nothing more than a series of distorted, unattainable dreams. And yet, the pull was irresistible. They found themselves opening more doors, knowing that each one would lead them further into madness. The final door appeared before them, but this one felt different. It felt heavier, as though it was waiting for them. The pull was stronger now, the need to know what lay behind it consuming them. They hesitated for a moment, but something inside them urged them forward. This was the last door, they had to open it. As they turned the handle, the door creaked open, revealing a room unlike any they had seen before. The room was empty, save for a single figure standing in the center. The figure was cloaked in shadow, its features obscured. As the protagonist stepped forward, the air grew thick with tension, the very atmosphere pressing in on them. The figure turned to face them. It was them, but it wasn't. The figure wore their face, their eyes, their expression, but it was distorted, a grotesque mockery of everything they had ever known. The figure smiled, but it wasn't a smile that they recognized. It was twisted, malicious, as if it knew something the protagonist didn't. It stepped forward, and the room seemed to close in around them. And then the voice came. "You have always been here." The words echoed in the protagonist's mind, reverberating through the very core of their being. They couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in around them, the door they had entered through vanishing behind them. They were trapped, and the figure in front of them reached out a hand. "Welcome to the core." It was a day like no other, but then again, in Ashpine Inn, nothing could be considered ordinary. Time itself seemed warped in the sprawling maze of hallways, twisting corridors, and eerie rooms that never fully conformed to the rules of the outside world. The inn was a place of memory and distortion, a place where the past collided with the present and the future was an enigma waiting to unfold. The protagonist, weary and disoriented, had wandered these hallways for what felt like an eternity. They had seen countless doors, each leading to fragmented memories of their life. Some doors opened to scenes of joy, others to sorrow, but all were tainted by the eerie aura of the inn. The walls whispered their name, and the floors groaned with secrets that had been buried for decades. It was on one of these days, when the fog of confusion had settled heavily upon them, that they found the last door. Unlike the others, this door didn't stand out immediately. It wasn't adorned with the familiar symbols or scrawls that decorated the other entrances. There was no label, no number, and no sign indicating its significance. It was just there, standing quietly at the end of a dimly lit corridor, almost as if waiting for the protagonist to find it. Its presence was subtle but undeniable. The air around it was thick with tension, as if the very fabric of reality bent in its direction. A faint hum emanated from the door, a sound that seemed to vibrate deep within the protagonist's chest. It was like a distant whisper, like the wind calling from a far-off place. The protagonist hesitated for only a moment, their hand trembling slightly as it reached for the cold brass doorknob. The urge to open it was overwhelming, like a magnetic pull that they could neither resist nor fully comprehend. Without thinking, they twisted the knob and stepped through. As they crossed the threshold, they were immediately enveloped by a strange, unsettling light. The room was vast, far larger than any of the previous rooms they had encountered in the inn. It stretched out before them in every direction, but its vastness was not comforting. It was suffocating, like a pressure that pushed down on their chest, making it hard to breathe. The air was thick, dense, and yet it shimmered with an eerie glow, an unnatural radiance that seemed to come from nowhere. It wasn't the soft golden hue of sunlight, nor the cold, harsh illumination of artificial light. No, this light was something else entirely. It felt wrong, yet strangely familiar, as if it were both foreign and deeply ingrained in the very essence of their being. The walls of the room were lined with mirrors, countless mirrors that stretched from floor to ceiling. They reflected the protagonist from every angle, but each reflection was subtly different. In one mirror, they appeared younger, their features softer, their eyes filled with naivete. In another, they appeared older, their face worn with the passage of time, their eyes tired and hollow. The reflections twisted and shifted, never quite the same, as if the protagonist was seeing themselves through 1,000 different lenses, each one distorting their image in its own way. It was then that they saw it, the core. It wasn't a physical being, not something that could be touched or held. It was more than that, an essence, a force that pervaded every corner of the room, of the inn, and most terrifying of all, it pervaded the protagonist's very existence. It was not something the protagonist could comprehend fully, but they could feel it. It was like a weight pressing down on their soul, a presence that seemed both ancient and eternal. The core was an embodiment of everything the protagonist had experienced, everything they had become, and everything they would eventually be. It was the culmination of their memories, their emotions, their actions, and it was bound to them in ways they couldn't escape. The core was not a separate entity, but rather a part of the protagonist, a part that had always been there, quietly shaping their existence without their knowledge. The moment the protagonist saw it, they understood. The core was not a force outside themselves, it was them. It was the essence of their being, intertwined with every choice, every moment, every breath they had ever taken. And as the core began to shift and change before them, the protagonist felt an overwhelming sense of inevitability. This was their fate. This was their purpose. The core didn't speak in words. It didn't need to. The truth it conveyed was felt in the marrow of the protagonist's bones, deep in the recesses of their mind. They had always been part of it. They had always been shaped by it, and they always would be. The core was not some malevolent force, but it was not benevolent either. It simply was. It was the pattern of existence, the cycle that governed everything, the invisible hand that guided their every step without them even knowing. The protagonist's eyes widened as the realization dawned on them. They had never been truly individual. They had always been part of the inn, part of its fabric. Their life, their memories, their choices had all been dictated by the unseen forces that had shaped them. The doors they had walked through, the moments they had lived, none of it was truly their own. It was all part of a much larger system, a cycle that was as old as the inn itself. The core spoke, not with words, but with a deep, resonant understanding that echoed through the protagonist's entire being. You have always been part of this place. You have always been part of me. The protagonist's body stiffened as the realization settled into their bones. This was their destiny. They were not an outsider to the inn. They were its very essence. They had always been a part of it, from the moment they first stepped foot into the inn to the moment they opened the final door. There was no escape. There was no freedom. The cycle would continue and the protagonist would remain a part of it forever. In that moment, the protagonists understood that they were no longer themselves. They had become something else, something that was both them and not them at the same time. The core had consumed them, had shaped them, and now it was time for them to assume their place within it. The room shifted once more, and the protagonists found themselves standing in front of a desk. Behind the desk sat a figure, but it wasn't a person. It was them. It was the protagonists, but not as they knew themselves. This figure was pale, expressionless, a reflection of everything they had become. And as the figure behind the desk reached forward, it handed them a key. The protagonist took the key. They didn't know why, but it felt familiar. It felt right. They turned and walked toward the door, but the hallway was no longer the same. It was longer, stretching out into infinity, and the doors that lined the walls were all identical. Each one was the same as the last, each one a reflection of the same distorted memories. And so, the protagonists took their place. They were now the clerk of the inn, perpetuating the cycle for new guests. They had become a part of the very fabric of Ashpine Inn, a reflection of everything that had come before them and everything that would come after. The story ended with the protagonist sitting behind the desk, watching the endless line of guests arrive, each one entering the inn and becoming part of the cycle, just as they had. They were no longer themselves, but a part of something far greater, something that transcended time and existence itself. And so the cycle continued forever. As the protagonist stood in front of the mirror, the world around them began to dissolve. What was once the reflection of a dimly lit hallway now shifted. The space was changing, becoming something unfamiliar and yet deeply intimate. The reflections around them grew clearer. They could see versions of themselves, versions from different points in their life, and some that had not yet come to pass. Their eyes caught a glimpse of their childhood self, standing in a corner of the room, silently observing them. They saw the young adult, lost in confusion, unsure of the road ahead, and then there was a future version, aged, weary, resigned. All of these reflections were not fixed. They moved, they evolved, and they transformed, as though the timeline itself was not linear, as though the boundaries of time had blurred in this place. The protagonists felt it in their bones. The weight of the years spent searching for something beyond this place. But now it was clear. There was no escape. There was no time, just endless cycles repeating, looping endlessly. The protagonists stepped forward, their feet moving of their own accord, drawn toward the reflection of their face, now distorted and fragmented in the glass. A distorted version of themselves stared back, smiling with an unsettling familiarity. Every face they saw felt like a part of them, an echo of someone who once lived in this world. And yet, no matter how much they searched for meaning, the meaning eluded them. Then they turned to face the core. It stood there in the center of the room, a shifting mass of light and shadow. It was not a creature, not a person, not even an entity as they understood it. It was everything and nothing, a representation of time itself, a reflection of their own essence. The core was an amalgamation of all the memories, all the past, all the desires that the protagonist had ever experienced. It was both comforting and terrifying. As it shifted and morphed, it seemed to draw closer to them, as though the walls of reality were collapsing into itself. "You've always been part of this place," the core seemed to say, its voice echoing in the protagonist's mind. "You are the inn, you are the reflection, the memory, the endless cycle." The words settled deep within the protagonist's chest, sending a chill down their spine. They understood, but they didn't want to understand. This place, this endless hallway, these mirrors, everything they had known and experienced, it was all part of something much larger. It was not something they could change. It was not something they could escape. The protagonist reached out instinctively, trying to touch the reflection of their past self, trying to reach the door that was always just out of their grasp. But as their fingers grazed the glass, they realized something deeply unsettling. They were touching nothing. They weren't even real. Their hand passed right through the mirror, through themselves. There was no physical form to grasp onto, no substance, no solid matter. The coldness of the mirror seeped into their skin, yet they felt nothing but emptiness. It was an all-consuming emptiness that stretched into the vast unknown, a hollow space in their chest. But at the same time, they felt something else, immense power. A force much greater than themselves that pulled at their very core, a power they had always known but never truly understood. A strange paradox formed inside their mind, one that rattled their very being. They were both everything and nothing. They were trapped within this infinite loop, and yet somehow they had always been a part of it. The reality of it was too much for them to comprehend. The struggle, the conflict between knowing and not knowing, tore at their sanity. The protagonist tried to speak, to ask the core what all of this meant. What was their purpose? But as they opened their mouth, the words dissolved before they could leave their lips. They tried again, but the words were lost, slipping through their fingers like grains of sand. There was nothing they could say that had not already been said. Nothing they could ask that had not already been asked. The core continued its endless presence, its voice now echoing in all directions, inside their head, inside their soul, like an endless whisper. You will become what you have always been. You will become part of the cycle, and the cycle will continue eternally. The protagonist felt an overwhelming sense of dread as they tried to move, to flee, but it was futile. No matter which direction they turned, no matter how hard they tried to escape, they always ended up in the same place. The hallway stretched on infinitely, always looping back to where they started. Every hallway led to the same doors, the same reflections, in the same empty spaces. Panic gripped their chest. They ran as fast as they could, yet their feet felt as though they were wading through thick, sticky tar. They turned around again, expecting to see the door, the exit, but there was no door. There was no exit. The walls of the hallway stretched on endlessly, and the reflections followed them, growing more distorted, more alien with every step. The core's voice echoed again, booming in their mind. There is no escape. You are part of the fabric of this place. The protagonists collapsed to their knees. The weight of the truth crushed them. This was their fate. This was the life they were destined to live. Forever. There would be no freedom, no ending. They would continue to walk the hallways of Ash Pine Inn, confronting their own reflection for eternity. A faint glow appeared at the far end of the hallway, growing brighter with each passing second. It was a door, but it was not the door they had been seeking. It was the final door, the one that had always been there, hidden in the distance. The protagonists stood, their legs trembling beneath them, and slowly walked toward it. As they reached for the door handle, they stopped. They looked back at the endless hallway, at the reflections of their past and future selves. They thought of everything they had gone through, every door they had opened, and every door that had been closed behind them. They knew what they had to do. The door swung open, but it wasn't a door to freedom. It was a door to the beginning of everything, a door that led to the role they were meant to play, the innkeeper. With a deep breath, the protagonist stepped through. The cycle was about to begin again. As the days, or what felt like days, passed by within the confines of Ash Pine Inn, the protagonist began to feel a creeping sense of understanding. At first, they fought it, dismissing it as a fleeting thought, an illusion brought on by the strange environment of the inn. But as time stretched, as the walls of the inn seemed to grow larger and the hallways longer, the realization settled in like a slow, suffocating weight. The protagonist wasn't sure how much time had passed. There were no clocks in Ash Pine Inn, no markers of hours or days. Time was irrelevant here, and that was part of the trick. The inn existed outside of time, a place where nothing changed, where no one ever truly moved forward. It was a place of stasis, an endless loop, a cycle that repeated itself over and over again. And at the center of it all was the protagonist, their reflection, their soul, trapped in a maze of distorted memories and forgotten identities. The rooms, the doors, the corridors, they were all connected in ways the protagonist couldn't quite understand. Each time they opened a door, they were faced with more memories, distorted, fragmented pieces of their life. But the further they walked, the more these memories began to feel like they belonged to someone else. Each door, each hallway pulled them deeper into a strange, inevitable force that was impossible to escape. It was then that they encountered the final door. This door stood at the end of a long, dark corridor, its frame shrouded in shadows. It wasn't like the others. The wood was weathered, with faint, unreadable symbols carved into its surface. As the protagonist stepped closer, they could feel the weight of it, the pull of something beyond. With a deep breath, they opened the door. Inside, the room was empty, save for one figure. A mirror, standing tall and cold in the center of the room. The reflection was not their own, but that of a shifting figure, one that morphed between various stages of their life. The face changed from the young child they once were to the teenager they had tried to forget, then to the adult who stood before the mirror now. And then something spoke. "Welcome to the end," the voice said. It wasn't a voice the protagonist recognized, yet it felt as though it had been part of them all along. "You've always been part of this place," the voice continued. "Every door, every hallway, every step you've taken, it's always led you here. You've been here before, and you will be here again." The protagonist's heart raced. They wanted to run, to flee, to deny everything they were hearing. But the weight of the words held them in place, as though the very air around them had turned into a cage. "What are you?" the protagonist finally asked, their voice barely a whisper. "I am the core," the voice replied. "I am the embodiment of everything you are, everything you've been, and everything you will become." The core? The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. This was it, the thing that had been pulling them through this endless maze of memories. The force that had been guiding them, shaping their every move. "You've been searching for meaning, for a way out," the core said. "But the truth is there's nowhere to go. There's nothing outside of this place. There is no escape." The protagonist felt their mind begin to unravel. The walls of the room seemed to close in on them, the air thick with the weight of their own realization. Everything they had ever known, everything they had ever hoped for. Was it all just a lie? Had they truly been stuck here forever? "You are not the first to come to me," the core continued, "nor will you be the last. There are countless others who have walked this path before you. They too sought a way out. They too believed they could escape, but they couldn't, and neither can you." The words hit the protagonist like a hammer, but something inside them stirred, a glimmer of resistance. "I don't accept this," they muttered, almost to themselves. "I won't become part of this place." The core's response was not anger or frustration. It was simply a slow, hollow laugh. "You already are," it said, the voice echoing in the room. "You always have been, and now it's time for you to assume your role. Your role as the keeper of the inn, the one who repeats the cycle forever, just as the others have before you." The room began to shift around them. The walls warped, the floor cracked, and suddenly the protagonist was no longer standing alone in the room. They were behind a desk, a small, cluttered desk, with papers and keys scattered around. They were wearing a name tag. "Clerk," it read, their name written in faded ink. "Your new life begins now," the core said, its voice reverberating through the room. "You will stand at this desk, just as you have always done. You will welcome the next guest who comes to the inn. You will repeat the same actions over and over again, and you will forget each time what you've already learned. The cycle will continue, and you will remain here forever." The protagonist felt the weight of it all. There was no choice. They were no longer themselves. They were no longer a person with desires, dreams, or hopes. They were a cog in the machine, a piece of the puzzle that could never be removed. The realization of what they had become was overwhelming. "You'll forget who you were," the core whispered, "but you'll never forget this place. It will always call you back, no matter where you go." And with that, the protagonist knew it was true. They had become part of the inn. They had become part of the never-ending cycle, locked in a loop that would never stop. The guest book in front of them began to fill in, names of new guests appearing one by one, each one unknowingly stepping into the same trap. And the protagonist, now the clerk, would always be there, welcoming them with a smile and sending them to their inevitable fate. The cycle had begun again, and they were no longer an individual. They were a part of the system now, forever. The transformation was silent, like a heavy fog settling into one's bones. The change wasn't physical, not in the way one might expect. It wasn't a grotesque or painful metamorphosis, but rather an inevitable shift, like a single thread slipping into the tapestry of a greater design. The protagonists no longer recognized themselves as an individual, as someone who had once walked freely with their own thoughts and desires. Those feelings, that sense of self, had evaporated like morning mist. Now they stood at the front desk of Ash Pine Inn, their form perfectly molded into the inn's identity. The once haunting corridors, the endless rows of doors that revealed fragmented memories, all of it was a part of them. They had become one with the very fabric of the inn. Every hallway, every door, every echo of their previous existence was now embedded in their soul. The cycle had absorbed them, as it had absorbed every other soul that had wandered through those cursed hallways. It was a familiar feeling now, like slipping back into a well-worn but perfectly fitting coat. They stood behind the desk, their hands resting lightly on the wooden surface, the same way the clerk had done before them, the same way the countless others had done before them. A soft creak echoed in the distance. The first guest had arrived. Their eyes, once full of their own quiet turmoil, now gleamed with a hollow emptiness, as if to signify the completion of the process. It was impossible to feel regret, to feel loss, because they had no longer had the capacity to feel at all. The guest appeared in the doorway, their face reflecting a mixture of confusion and exhaustion, as if they had just stumbled upon an unknown and forgotten destination. The protagonist's lips parted, a smile etched into their face, a smile devoid of warmth or recognition. It was the smile of someone who had long ago given up the pretense of individual choice, the smile of someone who had become part of a much larger, much darker entity. "Welcome to Ash Pine Inn," they said softly, their voice carrying a strange reverberation, like an echo from far beyond their own mind. "Your room is ready." The guest, unable to resist the allure of the inn, nodded slowly, their feet almost moving on their own as they approached the front desk. The protagonist slid the key over to them, the smooth brass of the key feeling strangely familiar in their hand, like it had been there forever. As the guest accepted the key, they glanced at the front desk. Something seemed wrong. The protagonist's eyes, though blank and emotionless, seemed to pierce through them. The guest shivered, though they couldn't place why. They took the key, but the strange feeling lingered, gnawing at the back of their mind. The protagonist watched them for a moment longer, their vacant smile never wavering. "Room 7, they said, their voice smooth, devoid of any real human warmth. "You'll find it on the left, down the hall." The guest nodded again, glancing back toward the long corridor. There was a strange familiarity to the hallways, like they had been here before, like the air tasted of memories they couldn't quite reach. And that was the point, wasn't it? The guest would never remember what had happened before. Their memories were distorted like a shattered mirror. The moment they stepped into Ash Pine Inn, they had already started to become part of it. Another fragment in an endless cycle. Their individuality, too, would be slowly consumed. The guest turned and walked down the hallway, but their steps were slow, heavy, as if they were being pulled towards something inevitable, something they could not understand but could not resist. The protagonist watched them go, knowing all too well the fate that awaited them. The guest would open their door, enter their room, and when they did, the mirror would fog up. It would reveal the same haunting message, the same truth. "You have already been here." The protagonist's smile deepened, a feeling that was once a reflection of humanity, now a hollow symbol of something far more ancient. They felt no sorrow for the guest, no pity. After all, they were part of the system now, the system that had no end, the system that took, consumed, and recycled, creating an endless loop. The inn itself was alive, or rather, it was alive in the way a machine is alive. It had no soul, no conscience. It only had one purpose: to absorb. And the protagonist had become its very essence. There was no escape, no way out. There was only the cycle. "Room 7 is just the beginning," they muttered softly, more to themselves than to anyone else. "And it will never end." The guests disappeared into the hallway, their footsteps fading as they moved further into the depths of Ash Pine Inn. The protagonist stood still, watching as the cycle began anew. A distant sound echoed through the hall, the same sound they had heard countless times before. It was the sound of a door creaking open, the sound of the inn welcoming another soul, another guest. They had come to know this sound all too well, and in a way it comforted them. It was a sound they had once dreaded, but now it was part of them, a sound they could never escape. The mirrors lining the hallway began to fog up, reflecting the guests' every movement. They were already becoming a part of the system, just as the protagonist had. And soon they would join the protagonist behind the front desk. They would take their place, and another would come to take theirs. It was a cycle that never stopped, a cycle that was older than time itself. The protagonist's smile widened, and the echo of their voice filled the hallway. "You'll remember me too," they whispered to no one in particular. As the guests reached their room, the protagonist knew exactly what would happen next. They would open the door, step inside, and the mirror would reveal their truth. It would show them the truth of what they had become, what they were always meant to be. And in that moment, as the door closed behind the guest, the protagonist felt a strange sensation. Something like the last flicker of a forgotten memory. A memory of who they once were. But it was fleeting, gone before it had the chance to take root. For the protagonist, the transformation was complete. They had become the inn itself. They had become the cycle. And there was no end, no beginning. Only the endless loop of time, space, and memory. The guest was now just another part of the machine. Just another piece in the puzzle. And the cycle would continue forever. The hallways of Ash Pine Inn never seemed to end. Every twist and turn seemed to lead back to where it all started. The walls, painted in dull shades of gray and brown, were like faded memories of a world that had long since ceased to exist. The flickering lights above cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch on forever, making it impossible to tell where one room ended and another began. And yet the inn persisted, unwavering, as if it had always been here and always would be. The protagonist stood at the entrance of the inn, now forever a part of its dark, cyclical existence. The guest book in front of them was never empty. Each day brought new faces, new souls to welcome into the endless labyrinth. Yet none of them were truly aware of the fate that awaited them. They were simply passing through, each one unknowingly stepping into a trap that would bind them to the inn forever. They had become a clerk, just as they had once feared. The transformation had been gradual at first, like a shadow slowly creeping into the corners of their mind. But now it was undeniable. They were no longer the person they had once been. Their individuality had been consumed by the inn, woven into its very fabric. They had become a part of the cycle, just as the countless guests who had come before them. Every guest, every reflection, every fleeting memory was now just another thread in the vast, tangled web of Ash Pine Inn. And yet, despite the overwhelming realization that they were trapped, the protagonists still found themselves compelled to carry out their duties. Every day, they greeted new arrivals with a smile that was no longer truly theirs, guiding them into the maze of rooms and mirrors. They showed them to their rooms, explained the rules of the inn, rules that seemed to change with every guest, but always led to the same conclusion. They watched as the guests entered their rooms, unaware that they would never leave. The core, that omnipresent force that had first revealed itself in the final room, continued to shape the protagonist's very being. It was no longer just a presence. They felt it in their bones, in their soul. It had become a part of them, as inescapable as the walls of the inn. The protagonist's thoughts, their desires, their very essence were now intertwined with the inn's purpose. There was no escaping it. Each guest that arrived seemed to bring with them a new memory, a new reflection of their past. Some were happy, some were tragic, but all were distorted in the same way. The inn twisted their memories, reshaping them into something unrecognizable. The guests would forget who they were, what they had done, and they would step into the rooms of Ash Pine Inn as if they were walking into a dream. And in a way they were. The protagonist would stand behind the desk, watching as the guests moved through the halls, unaware of the true nature of the place. They would speak to them, offering the same polite words they had used 1,000 times before. But deep inside, they knew the truth. The guests were never meant to leave. No one ever truly left the inn. Time had no meaning here. The days and nights blurred together, each one indistinguishable from the last. The rooms, once so familiar, had become a maze, their walls shifting and changing with each new guest. The mirrors reflected not just the present, but the past and future, showing glimpses of lives lived and lives yet to be. The protagonist had seen these reflections countless times before, but they still felt a strange pang of sorrow every time they looked into one. The inn's purpose, its true purpose, was becoming clearer with each passing day. It wasn't just a place for guests to stay. It was a prison, a holding cell for the souls of those trapped within it. The inn was alive, feeding off the memories and identities of its guests, twisting them into new forms, creating a never-ending cycle of repetition. Every guest that entered was just another piece in the puzzle, another cog in the machine. The protagonists could no longer tell where they began and where the inn ended. They had become a part of it, just as the inn had become a part of them. Their thoughts were no longer their own. They could feel the presence of the core in everything they did. Every word they spoke, every movement they made, was influenced by the inn's will. One day, the protagonist entered one of the rooms and saw a familiar face in the mirror. It was their own face, but different. It was older, worn by time, yet still bearing the same expression of confusion and fear that had haunted them from the very beginning. They reached out to touch the glass, but the reflection did not move. It stared back at them, as if waiting for them to understand. Suddenly, a voice echoed in their mind. "You're still here, you always have been." The words were chilling, but they were also strangely comforting. The protagonists realized then that they had never truly left the inn. They had always been a part of it, trapped in the endless cycle of existence, and they always would be. The door behind them creaked open. Another guest had arrived. The protagonist turned, feeling the familiar compulsion to greet them, to guide them into the rooms and mirrors. The cycle continued as it always had. But as they walked back to the desk, the protagonist couldn't help but wonder, would it ever end? Would they ever break free from the cycle that had consumed them? The answer, they knew deep down, was no. The inn would continue. Its hallways would stretch on forever, and the guests would come and go, unaware of the fate that awaited them. But the protagonist, now a part of the inn, would never escape. They were bound to it, just as the core was bound to them. And so the cycle continued.